Hey guys, it's Kat. Happy 2018. I know this is January 19th when I'm recording this, but Happy New Year all the same. I'm also working with a new audio editing software with a friend of mine. It's great. It's great. I have someone else to listen to me talk for hours and hours on end and then critique me about how shitty I sound. So, little updates on that. If the heater kicks on, don't freak out, because it's winter where I'm at. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy the video, and let's get into Mercedes Lackey's Magic's Pawn, Book 1 of the Last Herald Mage Trilogy, Chapter 8. Vaniel stared nervously at his own reflection in the window. A specter, pale and indistinct, ghost-like, with dark hollows for eyes. Beyond the glass, night blanketed the gardens. A moonless night. A night of wind and cloud, and no light at all. Not even starlight. Samhain night. The night of celebration of the harvest, but also the night set apart for remembering the dead of the year past. The night when, so most traditions held, the other world was closer than any other night. A night of profound darkness, like the one a moon ago when Stephen had been slain. Seville was with the rest of the heralds, mourning their dead of the year. Donnie and Mardic, having no one in need of remembrance, were with one of the other trainees at a palace fete, indulging in a certain amount of the superstitious foolery associated with Harvest Fest that was also a part of Samhain night, at least for the young. Lord Evan Lashara had gone home to Westrel Keep, presumably well satisfied with himself. There was no doubt in Vaniel's mind that Lord Evan had somehow extracted enough good information from what had been fed to him to deduce exactly what bait would serve best to lure Stephen to his death. They had tried to use him, and had ended up being used by him. And that was a blackly bitter thought. Tylendel and Vaniel had been left alone in the suite. Tylendel and Vaniel would not be mewed up in the suite much longer. "Are you ready?" Tylendel asked from the door behind him. Vaniel nodded, and pulled the hood of his dark blue cloak up over his head, trying not to shiver at his own reflection. With the hood shrouding his face, he looked like an image of death itself. Then Tylendel moved silently to his side, and then there were two of the hooded figures reflected in the clouded glass. Death and Death's shadow. He shook his head to free it of such ominous thoughts, as Tylendel opened the door and they stepped out into the cold, blustering night. This morning he had slipped out into Haven and bought a pair of nondescript horses from a down-at-the-heel beast trader, using most of the coin he and Tylendel had managed to scrape together over the past 3 weeks. He'd taken them off into the west end of the city and stabled them at an inn just outside the city wall. Tylendel had told Vaniel that before he worked the spell to take them within striking distance of the Lashara holding, he wanted to be out of the easy sensing range of the Herald Mages. They needed transportation, but it didn't matter how broken down the beasts were. Their horses only needed to last long enough to get them an hour's ride out of the city. After that, it wouldn't matter what became of them. Obviously, riding Gala was totally out of the question. They weren't taking Star, or borrowing, any of the true horses from the palace stables, because if their absence were noticed, Tylendel didn't want any suspicions aroused until it was too late to stop them. Vaniel had concurred without an argument. If they couldn't force their mounts through Tylendel's gate, and the trainee had indicated that they might not be able to, or might not want to, they were going to have to turn them loose to fend for themselves. He didn't want to lose Star, and he didn't want to be responsible for the loss of anyone else's prized mount either. The ice-edged wind caught at their cloaks, finding all the openings and cutting right through the heavy wool itself. Vaniel was shivering long before they slipped past the gate guard at the palace gates and out onto the streets of the city. The guard was preoccupied with warming himself at the charcoal brazier beside the gate. He didn't seem to notice them as they hugged the shadows of the side of the gate farthest from him, and took to the cobblestone street beyond. Now they were out in the wealthiest district of the city. The high buildings on either side of them served only to funnel the wind right at them. More so it seemed. Tylendel, who was still not entirely steady on his feet, grabbed Vaniel's arm and hung on. Vaniel could feel him shivering, partly with cold, but from the way his eyes were gleaming in the shadows of his hood, partly also with excitement. These mansions of the wealthy and high-born were mostly dark tonight. Another Harvest Fest tradition. The inhabitants either at the temple services or attending the Harvest Fest gathering at the palace. Vaniel had not received an invitation, and although he was anything but displeased, he wasn't entirely certain why he had not. His apparent about-face in regard to Tylendale had confused not only his own little circle, but the trainees and heralds as well, and no one had enlightened them. Seville had reckoned that keeping the rumor-goers confused would keep the real story from reaching Withen for a while, and buy them additional time. Assuming Lord Evan hadn't told him, just for the pure spite of making things difficult for Tylendale and Tylendale's lover. It would suit the man's character. Vaniel thought briefly of the Samhain fete he was missing. It was possible that those in charge of the festivities had assumed he would be staying at Tylendale's side, especially tonight. It was also possible that they blamed him for Tylendale's condition. Marduk had reported several stories to that effect, and were punishing him for his conduct. Whatever the reason, this had proved to be too good an opportunity to slip out undetected to let pass by. They turned a corner, and the buildings changed. Now they were smaller, crowded closer together, and no longer hidden behind walls. Each had candles in the otherwise darkened windows. Another Samhain custom. It was by the light of these candles that the two were finding their way. The torches that usually illuminated the street by night had long since blown out. Tylendale had been growing increasingly strange and withdrawn in the past several days since Vaniel had purloined Seville's magic books for him. Vaniel would wake up in the middle of the night to find him huddled in the chair, studying his handwritten copies of the two spells with fanatic and feverish concentration. During waking hours he would often stare for hours at nothing, or at a candle flame, and his conversation had become monosyllabic. The only time he seemed anything like his own self was when he'd begin a nightmare and Vaniel would wake him from it. Then he would cry for a while on Vaniel's shoulder and afterward talk until they both fell asleep. Then he sounded like the old Tylendale, not afraid to share his grief or his fears with the one he loved. But when day arrived, he would be back inside his shell, and nothing Vaniel could do or say could seem to crack that barrier. Vaniel had long since begun to think that he would never be his old self again, until his revenge had been accomplished, and he had begun to long for that moment with a fervor that nearly equaled his lover's. They reached the sector of shops and inns long before they saw another human being out on the streets, and that was only the night watch. The patrol of two men gave them hardly more than a passing glance. They were obviously unarmed except for knives, were too well dressed to be street toughs, and not flashy enough to be young highborns out to find some trouble. The two men of the watch gave them nearly simultaneous nods, curt and preoccupied. Nods which they returned as the light from the watch lantern in the hands of the rightmost one fell on them. Satisfied with what they saw, the watch passed on, and so did they. Boot heels clattering on the cobbles. Here the buildings were only 1 or 2 stories tall, and the wind howled and ramped about them unimpeded. The quality and state of repair of these buildings, mostly shops, inns, lodging houses, and workshops, declined steadily and rapidly as they neared the west city wall of Haven. The guards on the great gates of Haven were not in evidence tonight, although there was a viewport in the wall, and Vaniel could almost feel eyes on him as they passed below it. Obviously the guards found as little to alarm them in the two younglings as the watch had. They passed out under the wall with no challenge whatsoever. Once outside the west wall, they were in the lowest district of the city. Vaniel led the way to the ramshackle inn where he had left their sorry nags, fighting the wind every inch of the way, as it nearly tore the edges of his cloak out of his half-frozen hands. The Red Nose Inn was brightly lit and full to bursting with roisterers. Vaniel heard their out-of-tune singing and hoarse laughter even over the moaning of the wind as they passed by the open door. Smoke and light alike spilled out that door, and the wind carried a random puff of smoke into their eyes as they passed, a noisome smudge that made them cough and their eyes water for a moment before cleaner air whipped it out of their faces again. They ignored that open door and passed around to the side of the inn to the dirty courtyard and the stabling area. There was a single half-drunk groom on duty, slumped on a stack of hay bales by the stable door, illuminated by a feebly burning lantern. His head lolled on his chest as he snored, smelling, even in this wind, as if he'd fallen into a vat of cheap beer. Tallendale waited in the shadows beyond reach of the light from the smoking lantern that had hung in the lee of the stable door, while Vaniel shook the man's shoulder until he roused up. "Eh," the man grunted, peering into the shadows under Vaniel's hood in an unsuccessful attempt to make out his features. His breath was as foul as his clothing. His face was filthy and unshaven. His hair hung around his ears in lank, greasy ringlets. "What you want, then? Where be your nags?" "Already here," Vaniel replied in a tone as adult and brusque and gruff as he could manage. "Here." He shoved the claim chits at the groom, together with 2 silver pieces. The man stared stupidly at them for a moment, blinking in surprise as if he were having trouble telling the chits from the coins. Then he grinned in sudden comprehension, displaying a mouthful of half-rotten teeth, and nodded. "Now celebrating, eh, master? Just you wait right there." He shoved the coins and chits together into the pocket of his stained, oily leather apron, heaved himself up off his couch of hay bales, and staggered inside the stable door. He emerged a great deal sooner than Vaniel would have thought possible, leading a pair of scruffy-looking, nondescript brown geldings that were already saddled and bridled with patched and worn tack. Vaniel squinted at them in the smoky light, trying to make out if they were the same ones he'd bought this morning. Then realized it didn't matter if they were or not. It wasn't as if the horses he purchased were any kind of prized specimens. In fact, if these weren't his horses, they were likely as not to be an improvement over the ones he'd bought. He took the reins away from the groom without another word, turned and led them across the dirt court to where Tallendale was waiting, huddled against the inn wall in a futile attempt to avoid the biting wind. When he looked back over his shoulder, he could see that the groom had already flapped down on the straw bales and resumed his interrupted nap. He handed Tallendale the reins of the best of the 2 mounts, and scrambled into his own saddle. His flea-bitten beast skittered sideways in an attempt to avoid being mounted, and gave a half-hearted buck as Vaniel settled into his seat. Vaniel made a fist and gave it a good rap between the ears. The neck stopped trying to rid itself of its rider and settled down. The spine of his saddle was broken. The horse itself was sway-backed, and its gait was as rough as he'd ever had the misfortune to encounter. He hoped, as Tallendale took the lead and they headed down Exile's Road into the west, that they wouldn't be riding for too very long. The wind had died down, at least momentarily, when Tallendale finally stopped. It was so dark that the only way he really knew that Tallendale had pulled up was because of the sound of hooves on the hard surface of the road if him had stopped. They trusted to the fact that Exile's Road was lined on either side with hedges to keep their sorry beasts on the roadway. He kicked at his own mount and forced it forward until he could feel the presence of Tallendale and his horse bulking beside him. There was a flare of light. Vaniel winced away from it. It was quite painful after the near-total darkness of the last candle mark or so. When he could bear to look again, he saw that Tallendale had dismounted and was leading his horse, a red ball of mage light bobbing along above his head. He scrambled off his own mount, glad enough to be out of that excruciatingly uncomfortable saddle, snatched up the reins of the beast over its head, and hastened to catch up. "Are we far enough away yet?" he asked, longing for even a single word from the trainee to break the silence and tension. Tallendale's face was drawn and fey and strained. Tallendale's attention was plainly somewhere else, his whole aspect wrapped up in the kind of terrifying concentration that had been all too common to him of late. "Almost," he replied after a long and unnerving silence. His voice had a strange quality to it, as if Tallendale was having to work to even get a single word out past whatever he was concentrating on. "I'm looking for something." Vaniel shivered, and not from the cold. "What?" "A place to put the gate." They came to a break in the hedge. No, not a break. When Tallendale stopped and led his horse over to it, Vaniel could see that it was the remains of a gated opening in the hedge, long since overgrown. Beyond the gap something bulked darkly in the dim illumination provided by the mage light. Tallendale nodded slightly. "I thought I remembered this place," he muttered. he didn't seem to expect a response, so Vandal didn't make one. It was obvious that the horses were not going to be able to force themselves through so narrow a passage. Talendale stripped the bridle from his, hung it on the saddlebow, and gave the gelding a tremendous slap on the hip that made it snort with surprise and sent it clattering off into the darkness. Vandal did the same with his, not sorry to see it go, and turned away from the road to see that Talendale had already forced his way past the gap in the hedge and was now out of sight. Only the reddish glow of the mage light through the leafless branches of the hedgerow showed where he had gone. Vandal shoved his way past the branches, cursing as they caught on his cloak and scratched at his face. When he emerged, staggering, from the prickly entrance of stubborn bushes, he found that he was standing knee-deep in weeds, in what had been the yard of a small building. It could have been anything from a shop to a cottage, but it was now going to pieces. The yard was as overgrown as the gate had been. The building seemed to be entirely roofless, and the door and windows were mere holes in the walls. Talendale was examining the reins of the door with care. The gap where the door had been was a large one, easily large enough for a horse and rider to pass through. Talendale nodded again, and this time there was an expression of dour satisfaction on his face. "This will do," he said softly. "Van, think you're ready?" Vandal took a deep breath and tried to relax a little. "As ready as I'm ever going to get," he replied. Talendale turned and took both of Vandal's hands in his. He looked searchingly into Vandal's eyes for a long moment. "Van, I'm going to have to force that link between us wide open for this to work. I may hurt you. I'll try not to, but I can't promise. Are you still willing to help me?" Vandal nodded, thinking, "I've come this far. It would be stupid to back out at this point. Besides, he needs this. How can I not give it to him?" Talendale closed his eyes and his face froze into as impassive a mask as Vandal had ever worn. Vandal waited, trembling a little, for something to happen. For a long while, nothing did. Then, rage flared up in him, a consuming, obsessive anger that left very little room for anything else. One thing mattered. Staven was dead. One goal drove him: deal the same painful death to Staven's murderers. There was still a tiny corner of his mind that could think for itself and wonder at the overwhelming power of Talendale's fury. But that corner had been locked out of any position of control. The truism ran, pain shared is pain halved. But this pain was doubled on being shared. He turned to face the ancient doorway without any conscious decision to do so. Talendale turning even as he did. He saw Talendale raise his arms and cast a double handful of something powder-like on the ground before the door. Heard him begin a chant in some strange tongue, and hold his now empty hands palm outward to face the similarly empty gap. He felt something draining out of him, like blood draining from a wound, and felt that it was taking his strength with it. The edges of the ruined doorway were beginning to glow, the same sullen red as the mage light over Talendale's head, like the muted red of embers, as if the edge of the doorway smoldered. As more and more of Vandal's energy and strength drained from him, the ragged border brightened, and tiny threads of angry scarlet wavered from them into the space where the door had stood. More and more of these threads spun out, waving like water weeds in a current, until two of the ends connected across the gap. There was a surge of force out of him, a surge that nearly caused his knees to collapse, as the entire gap filled with a flare of blood-red light. Then, the light vanished, and the gap framed not a shadowed blackness, but a garden, a formal garden decorated for a festival and filled with people, light, and movement. He hardly had a chance to see this before Talendale grabbed his arm and pulled him, stumbling, across the threshold. There was a moment of total disorientation, as though the world had dropped from beneath his feet. Then, sound, laughter, music, shouting. He stood with Talendale facing that garden he had seen through the ruined doorway, and beyond the garden, a strange keep. Lanterns bobbed gaily in the branches of the row of trees that stood between them and the gathered people, and the trestle tables spread with food and lanterns were visible on the farther side. Near the trees was a lighted platform on which a band of motley musicians stood, playing with a vigor that partially made up for their lack of skill. Before the platform, a crowd of people were dancing in a ring, laughing and singing along with the music. Vaniel's knees would not hold him. As soon as Tylendale let go of his arm, his legs gave way, and he found himself half kneeling on the ground, dizzy, weak, and nauseated. Tylendale didn't notice. His attention was on the people celebrating. "They're celebrating," Tylendale whispered, and the anger Vaniel was inadvertently sharing surged along the link between them. "Stephen's dead, and they're celebrating." That small, rational corner still left to Vaniel whispered that this was only a harvest fest like any other, that the Lashar weren't partially gloating over an enemy's death, but that logical voice was too faint to be heard over the thunder of Tylendale's outrage. A wave of dizziness clouded his sight with a red mist, and he could hear his heart pounding in his ears. When he could see again, Tylendale had stepped away from him, and was standing between him and the line of upraised trees, with his hands high over his head. From Tylendale's upraised hands came twin bolts of the same vermilion lightning that had lashed the pine grove a moon ago. Only this lightning was controlled and directed, and it cracked across the garden and destroyed the trees standing between him and the gathered Lashar kin in less time than it took to blink. In the wake of the thunderbolt came startled screams. The music ended in a jangle of snapped strings and the squawk of horns. The dancers froze and clutched at each other in clumps of 2 to 5. Tylendale's mage light was blazing like a tiny scarlet sun above his head. His face was hate-filled and twisted with frenzy. Tears streaked his face, his voice cracked as he screamed at them. "He's dead, you bastards! He's dead, and you're laughing. You're singing. Damn you all, I'll teach you to sing a different song. You want magic? Well, here's magic for you." Vaniel couldn't move. He seemed tethered to the still glowing gate behind him. He could only watch numbly as Tylendale raised his hands again, and this time it was not lightning that cracked from his upraised hands. A glowing sphere appeared without a sound of thunder, suspended high above him. About the size of a melon, it hung in the air, rotating slowly, a smoky, sickly yellow. It grew as it turned and drifted silently away from Tylendale and toward the huddled Lashara folk, descending as it neared them, until it came to earth in the center of the blasted, blackened place where the trees had been a moment before. There it rested, still turning, still growing, until it had swelled to twice the height of a man. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, it burst. Another wave of disorientation washed over him. Vaniel blinked eyes that didn't seem to be focusing properly. Where the globe had rested, there seemed to be a twisting, twining mass of shadow shapes. Shapes as fluid as ink, as sinuous as snakes. Shapes that were there and not there, at one and the same time. Then they slid apart, those shapes separating into 5 writhing mist forms. They solidified. If some mad god had mated a viper and a coursing hound, and grown the resulting offspring to the size of a calf, the result might have looked something like the 5 creatures snarling and flowing lively around one another in the gleaming of Tylendale's mage light. In color, they were a smoky black, with skin that gave an impression of smooth scales rather than hair. They had long, long necks, too long by far, and arrowhead-shaped heads that were an uncanny mingling of snake and greyhound, with yellow, pupilless eyes that glowed in the same way and with the same shifting color that the globe had birthed them had glowed. These teeth in those narrow muzzles were needle-sharp and as long as a man's thumb. They had bodies like greyhounds as well, but the legs and tails seemed unhealthily stretched and unnaturally boneless. They regarded Tylendale with unwavering saffron eyes. They seemed to be waiting for something. He quavered out a single word, his voice breaking on the final high-pitched syllable, and they turned as one entity to face the cowering folk of Lashara, mouths gaping in unholy parodies of a dog's foolish grin. But before they had flowed a single step toward their victims, a shrill scream of equine defiance rang out from behind Vaniel, and Gala thundered through the gate at his back, pounding past him, then past Tylendale, ignoring the trainee completely. She screamed again, more anger and courage in her cry than Vaniel had ever thought possible to hear in a horse's voice, and skidded to a halt halfway between Tylendale and the things he had called up. She was glowing, just like she had during Lendel's fit, a pure, blue-white radiance that attracted the eye in the same way that the yellow glow of the beast eyes repelled. She continued to ignore Tylendale's presence entirely, turning her back to him, rearing up to her full height and pawing at the air with her forehooves, trumpeting a challenge to the 5 creatures before her. They reversed their positions in an instant, as her hooves touched the ground again, facing her with silent snarls of anger. She pawed the earth and bared her teeth at them, daring them to try and fight her. "Gala!" Tylendale cried in anguish, his voice breaking yet again. "Gala, don't!" She turned her head just enough to look him fully in the eyes, and Vaniel heard her mental reply as it rang through Tylendale's mind and heart and splintered his soul. "I do not know you," she said coldly, remotely. "You are not my chosen." And with those words, the bond that had been between them vanished. Vaniel could feel the emptiness where it had been, for he was still sharing everything Tylendale felt. Tylendale's rage shattered on the cold of those words. And when the bond was broken, what took its place was utter desolation. Vaniel moaned in anguish, sharing Tylendale's agony, and the torment and bereavement as he called after Gala with his mind and received not even an echo of a reply. Where there had been warmth and love and support, there was now nothing. Not even a ghost of what had been. The link between them surged with loss, and Vaniel's vision darkened. He heard Tylendale cry out Gala's name in utter despair, and willed his eyes to clear. And to his horror, he watched her fling herself at the 5 fiends, heedless of her own safety. They swarmed over and about her, their darkness extinguishing her light. He heard her shriek, but this time in pain. He saw the red splash of blood bloom vividly on her white coat. He tried to stagger to his feet, but had no strength. His ears roared, and he blacked out. He barely felt himself falling again, and only Tylendale's scream of anguish and loss penetrated enough to make him fight his way back to consciousness. He found himself half sprawled on the cold ground. He shoved himself partially erect, despite his spinning head, and he looked for Gala. But there was no companion, no fight, only a mutilated corpse, sprawling, torn, and ravaged, throat slashed to ribbons, the light gone from the sapphire eyes. Tylendale was on his knees beside her, stroking the ruined head, weeping hoarsely. Beside her lifeless body lay one of the 5 monstrosities, head a shapeless pulp. The others floated around the companion's body as if waiting for the corpse to rise again so that they could attack it. 2 of the others limped on 3 legs, but 2 were still unharmed. And given what they had done to Gala and a few heartbeats, 2 would be more than enough to slaughter every man, woman, and child of the Lashara. Finally, they left their mindless shark-like circling and turned to face the terrified celebrants. They took no more notice of Tylendale than of the dead companion. A man bolted from the crowd. With a start, Vaniel recognized him for Lord Evan. Whether he meant to attack the beasts or simply to flee, Vaniel couldn't tell. It really didn't matter much. One of the beasts that was still unhurt flashed across the intervening space and caught him. He did not even have time to cry out as it disemboweled him. A woman screamed, and that seemed to signal the beasts move again. They began to ooze in a body toward their victims. A bolt of brilliantly white lightning cracked from behind Vanel to scorch the earth before their leader. There was a pounding of hooves from the gate. Vanel was momentarily blinded by the light and by another surge of weakness that sent him sagging back onto the ground. When his eyes cleared again, there were 3 white-clad heralds and their 3 companions closing on the fiends, lightning crackling from their upraised hands. They were using the lightnings to herd the beasts into a tight little knot, barring their path to their prey. He barely had time to recognize 2 of the 3 as Seville and Jason before battle was joined. Once again he started to black out, feeling as if something was trying to pull his soul out of his body. He fought against unconsciousness, though he felt as if he had nothing left to fight with. Both the rage and despair were gone now, leaving only an empty place, a void that ached unbearably. He felt a tiny inflowing of strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him the means to fight the blackness away from his eyes, to fight off the vertigo, and to finally get a precarious hold on the world again. The first thing he saw was Tylendil, still on his knees, but no longer weeping. He was vacant-eyed, white as bleached linen, and staring at his own blood-smeared hands. Where the 5 creatures had been, there was now nothing. Only the mangled body of Gala and the burned and churned up earth. Taking her hand away from his shoulder was Seville, her face an unreadable mask. Seville pulled her attention away from Tylendil, who was slumped in a kind of trance of despair beside her, and back to what Vanel was telling the other 2 heralds. Then she said, "I don't know you. You aren't my chosen," the boy whispered, eyes dull and mirroring his exhaustion, voice colorless. And she turned her back on him, just turned away, and charged those things. "Buying time for us to get here," Jason murmured, his voice betraying the pain he would not show. "Oh, gods, the poor thing. If she hadn't bought us those moments, we'd have come in on a bloodbath." "She repudiated him," Landseer said, the Queen's own, as if he didn't believe it. "She repudiated him. And then suicided," Seville supplied flatly, her own heart in turmoil, aching for Tylendil, for the loss of Gala, for all the things she should have seen and hadn't. Gods, she suicided. She knew. She had to know that no single companion could face a pack of Wersa and survive. Tylendil sat where they had left him, unseeing, unspeaking, all of hell in his eyes. Mage lights of their own creation bobbed overhead, piteously illuminating everything. Jason contemplated Seville's trainee for a long moment, but said nothing. Only shook his head slightly. Then he spared a glance for Vanel and frowned. Seville heard his thought. "The boy is still tied to the gate, sister. He grows weaker by the moment. If you want him undamaged." Unspoken but not unfelt was the vague thought that perhaps it would be no bad thing if Vanel were to be forgotten until it was too late to save him from the after-effects of gate magic. That undercurrent of thought told Seville that Jason placed all of the blame for this squarely on Vanel's shoulders. "It wasn't his fault, Jason," she answered, heartsick and near to weeping, but unable to be anything other than honest. "He didn't do anything worse than go along with what Lendl wanted without telling me. What happened was as much due to my negligence as anything he did." Jason gave a curt nod, but a skeptical one. "In that case, we need to get that gate closed down as soon as possible, or the boy will sicken. Or worse." No need to ask what worse was. Vanel was already looking drawn, almost transparent, as the gate pulled more and more of his life force from him. How Tylendil, half-trained, and Vanel, ungifted, had managed that, Seville had no notion. But they dared not break the link until they didn't need the gate anymore. "Fine, but what are we going to do about all that mess?" Seville asked, nodding her head at the milling crowd, the mangled corpse of the single victim the Wersa had killed, and the pathetic body of the companion. "Somebody had better take them in hand, or no telling what they'll get up to. Go in for a wholesale slaughtering party on Talendel's people. Make up some kind of tale about Harold's being in on this. Even a hair away from breaking down into tears, she was still thinking. She couldn't help it. I'll stay here, Lancier volunteered. Elspeth can do without me for a moon or so. I'll take care of the Lashara and see to... His thought faltered. Gala. And you'll get home how? Jason asked, concerned. We're going to shut the gate from the other side as soon as we're through. You aren't up to gating by yourself these days. Like ordinary mortals, he replied with a deathly seriousness. On our feet. What are we going to do about? Seville's eyes flicked to Talendale and back. The boy was still staring vacantly into space, his face pale and blank, his eyes so full of inward-turned torment that she could scarcely bear to look into them for fear she would break down and cry. I don't know, Lancier replied bleakly. I just don't know. There's no precedent. Get the boy home. Worry about it when you've got time to think about it. Ask your companions. It was one of their number that died. That's all I can think of. But you'd better get on with it, if you expect to leave the other boy with a mind. Jays, take Tylendale, will you? Seville said aloud, reaching for Vaniel's arm and pulling him to his feet. Lance, God's with you, Heart Sibs, said the Queen's Own, pity and compassion momentarily transforming his homely face into something close to saintly, like that of a beautiful carved statue. You'll need their help. Daver? His companion sidled up to him and held rock still for Jason to help him mount. Like the Queen, like Seville, Lancier was feeling his age these autumn days, and needed the boost into place that Jason gave him. But once in the saddle, he resumed the strength and dignity of a much younger Queen's Own, the man he had been 20 years ago. Taver tossed his head and walked with calm and quiet steps toward the shocked, confused mob of Lashara at the other end of the garden. Jason tugged on Talendale's arm. The boy rose, but with the automatic movements of someone spellbound, his attention still turned within himself. The Seneschal's herald led the way to the gate, followed closely by his companion, and guiding the boy with a hand at his shoulder. He cast a look back at Seville. I don't fancy the notion of the ride we have ahead of us. Too many things to go wrong on the way. You know more about this spell than I do. Do you think you can reset this gate to bring us out at the palace? She wrenched her attention away from the unanswerable problem of what to do about the boys, and contemplated on the structure of the gate. The portal at this end was an ornamental gazebo in the center of the blasted garden. Through the arch of the entrance lay the dark of the ruinous cottage yard. I don't see any problem, she replied after study. I can bring us out in the Grove Temple, if that's all right. That should do, Jason said, eyeing the sky on the other side of the portal, which was flickering with lightnings. Good gods, why did that blow in? There wasn't a storm due. Don't look so surprised, Jays, she growled, needed to lash out at something, and using his absent-mindedness to make him the target. I've told you a dozen times that gating plays merry cob with the weather. That's why I don't like to use gates. It's going to get worse when I reset it, and all hell will break loose when I collapse it. He pursed his lips and frowned, but didn't reply. Just waved at her with his free hand. She let go of Vaniel, who sagged back to his knees, too weakened to stay standing without her support. She raised both her hands high above her head and made an intricately weaving little gesture. Filaments of dull red light floated from the gate toward her, and were caught up on her fingers by that complex weaving. When she had them fast, she clenched her hands on them and sent her will coursing down them in a surge of pure, commanding power, the filaments turning from red to white as her will flowed back along them. When the wave of white reached the gate, the portal misted over, then flared incandescently. When the light died, the scene framed in the gazebo arch was that of Companion's Field, seen by the fitful flashes of lightning as viewed from the porch of the Grove Temple. Seville reached down and caught the fabric of Vaniel's tunic, pulling him to his feet again. She dragged him with her as he followed closely on Jason's heels. He hurried across the gate threshold, pulling Tylendale before him. She half ran a step behind him, dragging Vaniel with her by main force. The gate crossing hit her with its all-too-familiar, sickening sensation of falling. Then, hard, smooth marble was beneath her feet, and they were home. Lightning struck a nearby tree, and thunder deafened her for a moment. She cleared out of the path of the gate, and Kellen and Phalar darted across, ears laid back as soon as she and Vaniel were out of the way. She let go of Vaniel, who stumbled the 2 steps to one of the pillars and clung to it. She turned to face the gate even as another bolt struck nearby. The gate was going unstable, wavering from red to white and back again. The instability in the energy fields mirrored in the increasing fury of the lightning storm overhead. She raised her hands and began the dismissal, and encountered unexpected resistance. She tried again, wincing at the crack of thunder directly above her. There was something wrong. Something very wrong. The gate was fighting her. "Jays!" she shouted over the growl of thunder and the whine of wind. "I need a hand here!" Jason let go of Tylendale to add his strength to hers. Their united wills worked at the spell knot, forcing it to unravel faster than it could knit itself back up again. With a surge of wild power that brought 6 lightning strikes down on the bell tower of the temple itself, the gate collapsed. Then again, the unexpected. The gate energy, instead of dissipating back into the air and ground, flared up and surged back down the one conduit left to it. The force line that had tied it into Vaniel. Seville saw it, but not in time to stop it. Vaniel screamed in agony, convulsing, clutching the pillar as the released power arced back into him, and from him a second, weaker arc leapt to Tylendale. Tylendale jerked into sudden alertness, and uttered the most painful cry of despair Seville had ever heard. It was a cry that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. She pivoted and grabbed for him as quickly as she could as Vaniel collapsed into a moaning heap at the foot of the pillar. But it was too late. No longer held in deceptive docility by his shock, he dodged her outstretched hand. She saw his face in another of the lightning flashes. His eyes were all pupil, his face a twisted mask of nothing but pain. He looked frantically about him with those terrible eyes that held no sanity at all, dodged her again, then dashed past her into the tangled trees of the grove. Jason gave chase. Seville limped after both of them. Lightning was striking so often now overhead that the sky was almost as bright as day. She tried to use the line of their shared magic to get at Tylendale's mind as she ran, hoping to bring him back to her, but stumbled in shock and fell when she touched his thoughts. There was nothing to get a hold on. The boy was a chaotic, aching void of grief and loneliness. It was so empty, so unhuman, that for a moment she could only crouch in the cold, dry grass and listen to her overworked heart beat in panic. It took every ounce of discipline she had to get her own mind back under control after touching that terrible, all-consuming sorrow. Belatedly, she thought of Vaniel. If anyone could reach Tylendale, surely he could. She lurched painfully to her feet and stumbled back toward the temple. In the lightning flashes, she could make out the younger boy staggering blindly out of the temple, clutching himself as if he were freezing. Saw himself stumble and fall on his shoulder without trying to save himself. Then she saw Tylendale dart out of the tree shadows to her right and race past her, past his fallen lover, and back into the temple itself. And her heart went cold with a sudden premonition of disaster. She forced her exhausted legs into a stumbling parody of a run, but she wasn't fast enough. Just as she reached the place where Vaniel lay, panting and moaning in pain, she saw his head snap up, as if in response to a call only he could hear. He seemed to be looking up at the tower that held the death bell. She heard him cry out something unintelligible and followed his horror-stricken glance and saw Tylendale, poised against the lightning-filled sky, arms spread, as if to fly, and saw him leap. He seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if he had somehow mastered flight. But only a moment. In the next heartbeat he was falling, falling. She couldn't tell if the scream she heard was hers or Vaniel's or both. It wasn't Tylendel's. His eyes were closed, his mouth twisted and jaw clenched in a rictus of pure grief. She felt the impact of his body with the unforgiving ground, as if it had been her own body that had fallen. And the scream ended. Jason stopped dead beside her, frozen mid-step. She whimpered in the back of her throat, and Jason walked slowly to the crumpled thing laying on the ground, not 20 paces from where she now stood. He went to his knees beside it, then looked up, and saw him shake his head slowly, confirming what she already knew. And at that moment, the death bell began solemnly tolling. She stumbled to Jason's side, each step costing her more in pain than she had felt in a lifetime of sacrifice to Queen and Circle. She went heavily to her knees and gathered up the limp, pitiable body to her breast. She held him, cradling him against her shoulder, gently rocking a little as if she held a small child. Tears coursed silently down her face to mingle with the rain that was pouring from the sky. It seemed that the whole world echoed her grief. Jason knelt beside her, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with sobs, as the companions gathered about them and the death bell tolled above them. It was only when the rest of the heralds arrived to take their burden from them that they thought of Vaniel and sent someone to look for him. But the boy was gone. So that was Mercedes Lackey's Magic's Pawn, Book 1 of the Last Herald Mage Trilogy, Chapter 8. Man, every time I say it, it's still a mouthful. I hope that I made you cry. Because I cry. Every single time. I am tearing up. And I cry every time. Don't blame me for your tears. Blame Mercedes Lackey. It's her book. I didn't write this. I'm just narrating it so you can feel my pain. I've only read this book maybe 30 times, like I've said in the past, but I cry every time. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Chapter 9, sometime within the next month, I believe. Not sure. I hope you liked this video. Share this video with your friends if you think they'll like it. Question time. What was your favorite part about if you had a holiday break, what was your favorite part about it? And don't forget to hit the little notification bell so you get notified every time I irregularly upload videos. So, I hope you guys all had a great day, night, whenever you're listening to this, in bed, in the car, during class. I hope you had a good one. Bye!